Why do some New York City apartments have a broker's fee that can be thousands of dollars, while other apartments are no fee? In this video, I'm going to explain how broker fees actually work in New York City, who pays them, and how the recently passed FAIR Act changed the system. I'll also go over some of the unsavory and sometimes illegal things agents do to get you to pay a fee, so make sure to stick around for that. So first, what exactly is a broker's fee? Very simply, a broker's fee is a fee that is paid to a real estate agent involved in renting an apartment. In New York City, a broker's fee typically ranges anywhere from 1 month's rent to 15% of the annual rent. So for a $4,000 apartment, a 15% fee would be $7,200 or 1.8 months rent. Now, the reason broker fees are so confusing in New York is because there are actually two different types of agents involved in renting apartments, and who pays the fee depends on who the agent is actually representing. The first type of agent is a landlord's agent, which is also known as the listing agent. As the name implies, a landlord's agent works for the landlord and represents the landlord's best interests when renting out an apartment. The second type of agent is a tenant agent, which is also known as a tenant representative. Tenant reps work for the renter and help them prepare for their search, find apartments, schedule tours, and assist with applications and negotiations. Now, before we get into the meat of it, I wanted to quickly introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Alan, and I'm a real estate agent that specializes in helping renters and buyers here in New York City. I also make videos about what it's like to move to and live in New York, so make sure to subscribe to learn more. If you're planning to move here and want help with your search, or if you'd like a copy of my free New York City Renter's Guide, I've included links in the description below. All right, let's get back into it. Now, prior to the passing of the FAIR Act, listing agents were allowed to charge the incoming tenant a broker's fee for renting an apartment, even if they represented the landlord and not the tenant. And because demand is traditionally very high in New York City, paying a broker's fee became a generally accepted cost of renting an apartment for tenants. In fact, the majority of non-luxury apartments were units where the tenant paid the broker's fee, not the landlord. However, this system changed in the summer of 2025 with the passing of a law called the FAIR Act, which significantly changed how broker fees work in New York. Under the FAIR Act, if a landlord hires a broker to rent out their apartment, the landlord must pay that broker's fee. In addition, if an apartment is advertised by a broker, the landlord is also responsible for paying the fee. This is an important nuance because there are many apartments where the landlord doesn't have an exclusive agent representing them, but brokers are still allowed to advertise those apartments. As a result, any apartment that is publicly listed by a broker should now be advertised as no fee. One common point of confusion is that the FAIR Act made broker fees completely illegal, which isn't true. Under the FAIR Act, a broker can still charge a fee if the renter chooses to hire that agent as their own tenant representative to help with their search. In those cases, the tenant rep typically charges a fee between 1 month's rent and 15% of the annual fee. Now, just to be clear, you don't have to hire a tenant rep to rent an apartment in New York. Many renters search on their own using sites like StreetEasy and schedule tours directly with listing agents. However, some renters do choose to hire a tenant rep because the market here can be extremely competitive, and having someone guide you through the process can make things a lot easier. So in simple terms, if a broker is advertising an apartment, the landlord should be paying the broker's fee, not the renter. And if you hire a broker to help you with the search, they can charge you a fee for the service. Now, unfortunately, even with the FAIR Act in place, renters may still run into situations where agents try to get them to pay the broker's fee anyway. The most common way they do this is the classic bait and switch, where they list an unavailable apartment as no fee and then try to flip you onto a fee apartment. When you reach out about the initial apartment, they'll typically tell you that there's an application on the apartment or that it is no longer available. They'll then tell you they have a similar apartment available, but that you'd have to sign a disclosure form stating that they're your agent and that you'd be responsible for the broker's fee. In other cases, they'll tell you to meet them at a different address, and then once you see the apartment, they'll tell you there's a fee because it's an off-market apartment that isn't available to the general public. It's framed as being more exclusive, though it's just another version of the same bait and switch at its core. This tends to happen a lot more for apartments that are listed without a specific address, although bait and switch can generally happen across all listing types and all platforms. Another common thing some agents do is to advertise an apartment at a rent such as $3,600. Upon seeing the apartment, they'll then tell you that the $3,600 only applies if you're the one that pays the fee, but that the landlord is willing to make a no fee at $4,000. It's sometimes framed as being in line with the Fair Act because there is technically the option of renting the apartment as a no fee unit. However, this can become a bit of a legal gray area. Since the Fair Act is relatively new, how some of these situations are interpreted and enforced may continue to evolve. In general, though, the main premise of the Fair Act is that any broker advertising an apartment on behalf of the landlord must be paid by the landlord, not the renter. Structuring the listing so that the renter can pay the fee in exchange for a lower rent may conflict with the intent of the law, since the broker was originally advertising the apartment for the landlord. In practice, though, this situation can sometimes be a bit tricky from a renter's perspective. For example, if an apartment is advertised at $3,600 with a broker's fee, or $4,000 as a no-fee apartment, the higher rent might actually cost more over time. That extra $400 per month would add up to $4,800 over the course of a year, which could easily be more than paying a 1-month broker's fee upfront. Rent increases also compound over time, since future lease renewals are typically based on the current rent. So while the Fair Act changed how broker fees are supposed to work, renters should still pay attention to the overall cost structure of the apartment and understand how the numbers work in practice. As someone that works as a tenant rep here in New York, I see these situations come up fairly often, and this is where working with a tenant rep can be very helpful. A good tenant rep can help filter out bait and switch listings, identify apartments that are actually available, and focus your search on units that realistically work for your budget and qualifications. They can also help you navigate any potentially tricky situations and help you decide what makes the best financial sense for you overall. Helping renters and buyers navigate the New York market is something I do here in the city, so if you're planning a move and think you might need help, I've included some information in the description below. One final thing worth mentioning is that because the Fair Act is still relatively new, the way the market is responding continues to evolve, although there are two main things I've noticed. I have also been told these same things pretty often by clients I work with. One is that there are fewer apartments being advertised by brokers, since that means the landlord would be responsible for paying the fee. Now, while a lot of landlords have accepted and adopted having to pay the fee, there are also landlords that still aren't willing to do so. As a result, these listings are made available to brokers, but they are not being advertised. Brokers either bring clients they're already representing to these listings, or some brokers end up resorting to the shadier tactics mentioned earlier. Interestingly enough, while the law was designed to help renters, it also reduced a lot of the transparency that was achieved, since a segment of the market is no longer listed online. The second thing that seems to have happened is that prices have gone up on some of the apartments. Now, StreetEasy consistently maintains that rent increases are modest and mostly the result of factors unrelated to the Fair Act, but from a day-to-day perspective, looking at listings and hearing about renters' experiences, it definitely feels like rents have gone up quite a bit. In fact, I find myself thinking more often these days that some of the prices we're seeing are just insane compared to the past. In general, though, the Fair Act did accomplish one major change. It made the broker's fee optional if you chose to hire your own agent, rather than mandatory, simply because the landlord didn't want to pay their broker. From that perspective, it eliminated an upfront cost that was a huge barrier of entry for a lot of people. Alright, so that does it for this video. As a quick recap, the biggest takeaway is that the person who hired the agent must pay the agent. If an agent is listing the apartment, then they must be paid by the landlord. And if you hire an agent to help you, there's typically a fee of 1 month's rent to 15% of the annual rent. Now, if you're planning to move to New York and want help navigating the rental process or with purchasing, I've included information in the description below about how I can help with your search. I've also included a link to download my free New York City Renters Guide as well. And if you found this video helpful, please make sure to subscribe. I make videos about what it's like to move to and live in New York City, along with guides to help you avoid some of the common mistakes people make when renting here. Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.